Okay, this time we are talking about domestic violence. This is lecture 7.1. This is a topic that impacts many people very closely. And if you are somebody that thinks you might need help dealing with domestic violence, you can call 1-800-799-7233. Our agenda for this lecture is to talk about some general information and theory. We'll then talk about spouse and partner abuse. We will then address child abuse and elder abuse. And then we will respond to, we'll talk about how social institutions try to deal with these issues. Every day, thousands of Americans are victims of family violence. This includes children, this includes spouses, and this includes older people as well. The family, unfortunately, is one of our most violent social institutions. When we think of violent social institutions, we don't usually think of our family and the people we live with. But a lot of the violence that occurs in our society happens within the family. There are many myths and facts surrounding domestic violence. There's a myth that family violence only impacts the poor, that poor people, poor men particularly, hit their wives. The reality is that all social classes are impacted by family violence, but we are more prone to seeing poor people causing harm to their family members, but that's because poor people tend to live closer to each other, right? Rich people who have giant houses far away from everyone else, they can hide their violent outbursts against their family members. But when someone is living in an apartment next door to you, then they're less able to hide it. Another myth is that violence and love are so opposite that they can't exist together. And this is a major and dangerous myth. Parents often resort to violence for disciplining their children. And there are cultural understandings in our society that people think that it's okay to hit their children. And then some of those people that hit their children become extreme and it gets out of control, and that is absolutely violence against children. Similarly, a violent spouse often expresses love for their victims. They say things like, if I didn't love you so much, I wouldn't have to do this to you. And it may be in a twisted way that that violent spouse does love that person, but also that behavior is just devastating to the victim. Another myth is that if you are abused as a child, you will abuse your children. This is a particularly tough myth to deal with because um, because there's slight truth in it. 70% of children who are abused do not grow up to abuse their children. So most children who are abused don't abuse their children. But with that said, 30% of children who are abused do grow up to abuse their children. And if you, child abusers are often people who were abused growing up because they learned that abuse equals love. But with that said, most people who were abused their children don't do that. Another tricky myth is that heavy drinking causes family violence. Now, with that said, heavy drinking does not usually cause the violence, but husbands who drink heavily are 3 times more likely to be abusive. However, drinking aggravates the abuse. It does not cause it, right? So, someone who's already abusive, when they drink, they might tend to be abusive, right? But that's not what creates the abusive individual. There's a really good discussion of this on page 119 of your textbook. So we've talked about some of those myths. Let's talk about the extent of family violence. If we use a very narrow definition of family violence, so we only are categorizing family violence as physical and sexual violence, which is pretty easy to categorize, right? It's you can gauge in certain ways when it's happening. That 14% of wives experience marital rape, 3% of wives experience beatings, 6% of children experience child abuse, and 2% of the elderly experience abuse. And all of these numbers, remember, these are conservative estimates. These are using a very specific gauge, and there are other types of violence that aren't used by this gauge. So if any, these are probably low estimates. And these statistics do not include emotional or psychological abuse. Theories of family violence. We have social learning theory, which states that people are likely to engage in family violence if they have been exposed to violence themselves. Children learn that violence is appropriate as a way to deal with interpersonal problems. So this is directly talking to that 30% of children who were abused as children that go on to abuse their children, right? Well, in that 30%, those people somehow learned the wrong message that violence is a good way to raise your children, or to deal with your spouse or whatever. So that's what social learning theory deals with, is that 30% of abused people. Stress theory states that some people who experience stress turn to violence. Not all people, certainly, but stress can cause a otherwise okay relationship to turn violent. With that said, stress isn't the only factor. It's one of many factors in almost all those cases. And exchange theory states that people are likely to commit violence if they benefit of it greater than the cost of punishment. So what does that mean? It makes the argument that if people are violent, if they commit acts of violence and they think they aren't going to get caught, then they will be likely to do that violence. And that is certainly more of a criminal justice theory than a sociological theory, but there is something to it. Maybe if we prosecuted people who committed acts of domestic violence more in our society, maybe some of those behaviors would go away. Let's talk specifically about spousal or partner abuse. So marital rape is the raping of a spouse by a spouse. Typically when it happens, it is a man raping a woman. This is the most prevalent form of rape. Most of the rape that occurs in our society is a man raping his wife. And 14% of wives report experiencing marital rape at some point during their marriage. And most of that rape involves the use of physical force. Often, forced anal intercourse occurs more often than vaginal rapes, and this indicates the humiliation aspect and the punishment aspect of rape, right? It's a common misperception that rape is about sexual desire. That is a factor, but rape is more about aggression, domination, and punishing the individual. And this, you might notice, is pretty heteronormative, right? It's talking about heterosexual relationships, or at least male-female relationships. Trends indicate that there are similar rates within the LGBT community as there are among heterosexuals for marital rape, but because same-sex marriages have not been recognized for as long by our society, we don't have as much data to say. So we can't really say for sure. Within the next 10 or 20 years, we'll have more data to study this phenomena. But because same-sex marriage has only really been legal for about 5 years now, we don't have that much data. There are 3 causes of marital rape. First of all is the sexist belief that husbands are entitled to have sex with their wives. A lot of this is based in patriarchy and sexism and the belief that men should have control over women. So there is a sexist belief that it is part of the job of the woman in the marriage to have sex with the husband, right? And when that belief turns violent, then we get rape. Also, as mentioned, husbands' attempts to punish wives. If we break it down, this is probably the more likely cause of many marital rapes because, as we said, it is part of social control. And similarly, husbands' attempts to use rape as a form of control of their wives. So those second two are really part of the same phenomena. Spousal assault, so this is moving on from assault as opposed to just rape, occurs in 1/3 of all married couples every year. That is a huge and very troubling statistic. So 33%. Abusive husbands abusive husbands act as if they have a license to batter their wives. So an abusive husband or an abusive partner, they justify it by saying, well, I'm the man, I'm allowed to do this. And this often results in post-traumatic stress disorder and what was once called battered woman syndrome. So the same psychological conditions that we see in wives and other spouses who have been abused, that is the same psychological condition as soldiers who have seen trauma in a war zone. And that's profound, is that bad marriages cause a psychological disorder that we see in war zones, right? That is something. Spousal and partner abuse. Here's some more information. The overwhelming majority of abused women do leave their abusive relationships, so that's good. And we do have the social structures in our society to help women leave their abusive partners. Feminist theorists, as I pointed to some, blame patriarchal elements within our society. So those societies that say that men should be in charge of women, that men should make decisions, that men have the right to have sex with their wives, those are pointed to by feminist theorists as being a major factor in these cases. Now let's move on to talk about child abuse and abuse of the elderly. So, child abuse victimizes millions of children a year. 20% of women report... Yeah, okay, sorry. That tripped me up for a second. 20% of women report having suffered sexual abuse from family members during childhood and adolescence. And that is, again, another really high statistic. If you're either not familiar with the phenomena or you're not familiar with this this issue, 20% of women, 1 in 5 women suffered sexual abuse from family members during childhood or adolescence. That's 10% of the American population. That's crazy. And daughters are the most likely victims. Again, this could be pointed to in the patriarchy. Fathers and stepfathers are most likely to be offenders. And I'm a father myself. None of this means that if you're a father, you will do these things, right? But if we look at the statistics, the people that are doing those things are fathers and stepfathers in many cases. There are just so many elements of this phenomena that are deeply, deeply troubling. Abuse has specific symptoms that are not directly related to assault, and these are the symptoms that those people that are trained in our society to catch these symptoms watch out for. Victims of child abuse, so children who have been abused, are more prone to poor academic performance. So especially if a child had been performing well and then suddenly starts performing poorly, it can be an indicator. Delinquency, so abuse causes children to not really being able to tell what the rules are in society. So being abused causes children, contrary to the belief that what abusers believe, Abuse causes children to actually behave worse. And also, later on, a child who was abused is more likely to turn to drugs and crime. And a lot of this, like I stated, is caused by confusion over what are the rules to society. So, what causes this stuff? As I mentioned, 30% of abusers were abused as children. So, this is a cyclical or even circular type of abuse. And many of the abusers, were abused as children. Society accepts the use of physical violence as an appropriate method to disciplining children. Now, given in the 1950s or 60s, it was widely accepted that you should hit your children, even hit them with objects. Now we have largely moved away from that model, but still some people think that striking their children, some forms of spanking are acceptable, and if you are in a situation where you would use physical force to discipline a child, that doesn't even necessarily mean you're abusing your children, but those people who do abuse their children use the same justifications as people who spank their children, and they might even call it spanking, while in reality they're hitting them with a curtain rod or a spoon or something like that. Not necessarily. Anyway. Also, poverty, unemployment, and lack of education also contribute to child abuse. Yeah. Now, elder abuse is a slightly different phenomena than child abuse. 25% of the elderly require long-term care, and some of those who require long-term care are abused by their caretakers. The elderly who live with overstressed relatives are the most likely to be abused. So, if a elderly person that needs that care, if they get that care from their family members and that family member becomes overly psychologically taxed and can't really deal with the situation anymore, then that family member is prone to striking or physically harming the elderly person. And neglect, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation are the most common forms of abuse of the elderly. So, and this neglect and financial exploitation are things that happen to the elderly that don't happen to children as much. Children can suffer from neglect. Neglect being ignoring the needs of the individual. Financial exploitation is kind of unique to elderly people because kids don't have money, right? Kids didn't ever make money, but it is a phenomenon among the elderly that they earned money over their lifetime, and their children feel that they are entitled to that money before the person dies. The fact of the matter is that that money is that person's money legally, and you can't just take your old parents' money, effectively. That's completely against the law. Now let's talk about profiles of abusers. Abusers tend to be young. So when I say that, I mean people from the age of about 18 to about 30. They tend to be lower income individuals. They tend to have a stressful home life. And they tend to be socially isolated from others in the community. All of these, one of these factors does not make you more likely to be an abuser, but you combine all of those factors and that can make the individual more prone. You can have all of these factors and not be an abusive individual, but they come together. They make you more susceptible to the behavior. Women are slightly more likely than men to abuse, actually. It's not just men. However, women are not typically those who commit serious assault or incest, right? So those elements of abuse that are not punching, kicking, seriously assaulting individuals, those behaviors that don't get people in the emergency room are those that women are more likely to do. So for that reason, women are less likely effectively to get caught in their abuse, and women do not typically sexually abuse children. And that both the serious assault and the incest element uh, may be tied to the fact that women tend to be responsible in a greater way for childcare. Thus, those men who do commit serious assault and do commit incest are more likely to be detached from their victims. They're less emotionally committed to their victims, and therefore they're more able to commit these terrible acts. Stressful home life and social insulation also increase the likelihood of family violence. Outside observers may increase the chance of abuse. So if the abuser knows that other people outside of the family unit might observe the abuse, that decreases the chance of abuse. And isolated parents may become unstable mentally and socially as well. Social isolation, even social isolation within like a three-person family, right? If that three-person family is isolated from the rest of the world, that can cause over emotional burden within the family unit, and it can cause mental unwellness. Let's talk about some of the ways society responds to family violence. Sacredness of the family leads to lenient treatment of family violence. So the family is an important institution in our society. Family is very close to our hearts. And for that reason, for those good feelings we have about the family, it often, unfortunately, allows us to excuse this horrible behavior, because we wouldn't want people to intrude in our family, because we respect our family so much. We respect other people's families, but unfortunately that respect allows abusers to be able to do the terrible things that they do. It's a really wicked system. And there are laws against marital rape. There are laws against domestic abuse. And nearly every community has shelters and safe houses to protect victims. These include counseling programs for victims to help them escape the situation. And actually, no matter where you are, chances are there is a facility in your community dedicated to this. But they are usually kept secret, and they're not obvious to the community. Even if you live next door to a facility like this, it looks just like an ordinary house. The only thing you might observe is there might be a lot of roommates living in a house, maybe a lot of women and a lot of children, and maybe they move in and out, right? That would be the only real indicator of such a place, and even then, they tend to be really covert about things. And those are dedicated to helping primarily women escape abusive situations. There is no formal government protective service against agencies for the elderly, but most states do have mandatory reporting laws to help the elderly. The elderly are particularly prone to violence, which is, again, super unfortunate. And as I mentioned, certain professionals are required to report child abuse to Child Protective Services. And it's not just when they know child abuse is happening, it's certain types of physical injuries, and certain types of physical injuries do have to be reported, especially by doctors, because certain types of physical injuries only really happen when a grown adult is attacking a child. There are certain, of course, freak instances where a really weird accident happens, but if it's investigated, then that investigation will show that it was a freak accident, right? And given the investigation process is scary, I have good friends that have gone through it because, again, their kids got in a freak accident. But I mean, this is my personal belief. I do believe the system works. So doctors, social workers are also trained to recognize these things, and also teachers. Because teachers have prolonged experience with children, they are specifically trained and specifically required in most states to report domestic abuse when they see it. Okay, yeah, I know this is a really tough topic to talk about, and we're going to be talking about it through this week in our discussion boards and our assignments. Um, Talk to you soon, and if you need help, please get it.